The left rear wheel of Fannie Bishop's wagon gave out with a sound like a gunshot, cracking clean through its iron-banded spoke, just 2 miles outside of Harlan Creek, Texas, on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1882, and it was either the worst luck she had experienced in 26 years of living, or the very best, though she would not know which for some time yet. She did not cry out when it happened. She did not scream or wring her hands or collapse against the seat in despair. She simply pulled back on the reins, steadied her mare, a gray roan named Pearl who had startled badly at the sudden lurch, and stepped down from the listing wagon with the careful, measured movement of a woman who had learned long ago that hysteria solved nothing. Her spine was straight, her chin was level, and the set of her jaw was the kind of set that made men think twice before offering unsolicited opinions. The wheel was ruined. That much was plain to see. The spoke had not merely cracked but had sheared through entirely, and the weight of the wagon had shifted onto the iron rim in a way that had bent it slightly inward. It would not roll another foot. Not today, and not without tools she did not carry and skills she did not possess. She stood in the road and looked at the wheel for a long moment, shading her eyes with one hand against the broad afternoon sun. The Texas prairie stretched in every direction around her, golden and indifferent, dotted with scrub oak and prickly pear cactus, alive with the whirring of insects. The road she had been following was little more than 2 parallel ruts worn into the dry earth by wagon traffic, heading southwest toward the small ranching community she had been told about by the station master in Abilene, a man named Mr. Greer, who had pointed her toward Harlan Creek and said that a widow woman named Clara Petch had a room to let and good cooking besides. But Fannie was not in the habit of waiting for trouble to solve itself. She unhitched Pearl from the wagon traces, led the mare around to a patch of sparse grass at the roadside, and tied her loosely to a scrubby mesquite. Then she took stock of what she could see from the road. To the east, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, a line of fencing ran parallel to a creek bed. Beyond the fence, cattle grazed in clusters, their hides dark against the pale grass. Beyond the cattle, at a distance she estimated at perhaps half a mile, the roofline of a ranch house rose against the sky, accompanied by the angular silhouette of a barn and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from a chimney, thin and pale in the warm afternoon air. A ranch meant tools. A ranch meant men who knew how to fix wagon wheels. She did not particularly relish asking for help, never had, but she was practical enough to recognize when pride had to concede to circumstance. She took her carpetbag from the wagon bed, the one that held her important papers and her small amount of money, and the miniature portrait of her mother that she had carried since she was 7 years old, slung it over her shoulder, and started walking toward that roofline with the same steady, unhurried stride that had carried her through harder things than a broken wheel. The gate in the fence was a simple wooden affair with a wire loop latch. She let herself through, relatched it carefully behind her, which would matter to whoever owned the cattle on the other side of it, and continued walking. The grass was longer here than along the road, and her boots were not made for rough walking, but she did not alter her pace. She was perhaps 200 yards from the main house when she heard hoofbeats coming from her left, fast and purposeful, and she turned to see a rider coming toward her at a canter across the open pasture. He pulled up his horse about 20 feet from her, a big bay gelding, and looked down at her from beneath the brim of a weathered felt hat. The man was perhaps 30 years old, or close to it, broad through the shoulders, lean in the face, with the kind of permanent sun-browning that came from working outdoors every day of an adult life. His jaw carried several days' worth of dark stubble, and his eyes, when he pushed his hat back slightly to look at her, were a particular shade of gray-green that she had never seen before on a person. He was wearing a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his forearms were dusty, which meant he had been doing physical labor before she had interrupted him. He did not look threatening. He looked cautious, which was sensible, and slightly surprised, which was understandable, given that she had come walking across his pasture unannounced. "This is private land," he said, His voice was low and even, not unkind but not warm either. "I know it is," she said. "My wagon wheel broke on the road back there. I saw your ranch and came to ask if you might have the tools and the inclination to help me fix it." He studied her for a moment. Then he looked past her toward the road, though the wagon was not visible from where they stood. Then he looked back at her. "You came through my gate," he said. "I did. I latched it behind me. I counted 7 head of cattle on this side when I came in, and they are all still on this side." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "You counted my cattle. I was raised on a farm. You always latch the gate and you always count what is on the other side so you know whether anything has wandered." He was quiet for another moment. Then he swung down from the saddle in a single fluid motion and stood on the ground before her, and she revised her earlier estimate of him upward by several inches. He was taller than he had looked on horseback. "Clayton Archer," he said, and extended his hand. "Fannie Bishop," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm, and her answering grip was equally so, which seemed to register with him. "Where is the wagon?" "On the road, about 2 miles southwest of whatever town is nearest. A man in Abilene told me Harlan Creek was this direction." "It is, about 2.5 miles further on." He looked at her carpetbag. "You are traveling alone." "I am." He accepted this without further comment, which she appreciated. Many men would have pressed the point or offered unsolicited observations about the wisdom of a lone woman traveling the Texas prairie. Clayton Archer simply turned and looked toward the road. "I will take a look at the wheel," he said. "If it is fixable on the road, I will fix it there. If it needs more than that, we will bring the wagon into the barn." He turned back to her. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "You can take the gelding back to the barn. I will walk to the road and assess the situation." She looked at the big bay horse, who was watching her with one dark eye. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I walked this far and my legs are still working. I will walk back with you." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Suit yourself," he said, and started walking. She fell into step beside him, and they went back through the gate, which he latched as carefully as she had done, and down to the road where her wagon sat canted at its unfortunate angle, with Pearl pulling at the mesquite grass and paying the whole situation no mind at all. Clayton crouched down beside the broken wheel and examined it with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who was accustomed to assessing damage and devising solutions. He ran his fingers along the sheared spoke, checked the condition of the hub, looked at the rim, and stood up. "Hub is fine," he said. "Rim is bent but not beyond fixing. The spoke is the real problem. I have spares at the barn and the tools to do it, but I cannot do it on the road. The wagon needs to come in." "How do we get it there on 3 wheels?" He looked at the wagon, then back at her. "I will ride back and get the draft team and a rope. We can drag it if we have to, but I think with the rope supporting the axle we can get it there without too much damage to the rim." "All right," she said. He swung up onto the bay gelding again. "I will be back inside of 20 minutes. You will be all right here." "I have been all right for 26 years," she said pleasantly. "I expect I can manage 20 minutes. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes for just a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned the horse and rode back toward the ranch at a canter. She sat down on the wagon seat and waited, which she did not particularly enjoy, but was prepared to do with composure. The afternoon was warm, dry, and pleasantly fragrant with the smell of sun-heated grass and mesquite. Somewhere nearby, a mockingbird was cycling through its repertoire of borrowed songs, cycling from a meadowlark's whistle to a blue jay's harsh cry to something she did not recognize, all without seeming to pause for breath. She had been in Texas for 9 days. She had come from Georgia, from a small city called Macon, where she had spent the previous 4 years teaching school and living in the respectable boarding house of Mrs. Alderton on Poplar Street. Before that, briefly, there had been a marriage. It had lasted 11 months, which was long enough to teach her that the man she had married, a lawyer named Gerald Bishop, was a man of considerable charm and considerable weakness, and that these two qualities did not improve one another. He had died in January of 1880 from a fever, leaving her his name, a modest sum of debt, and no children. She had settled the debt, kept the name because changing it seemed like more trouble than it was worth, and gone back to teaching. But Georgia had begun to feel too small. Or perhaps it was Macon that felt too small, or Mrs. Alderton's boarding house, or the particular feeling of being 26 years old and perfectly capable, and finding that the world in that part of the South, in 1882, had a very limited idea of what a woman of her description was supposed to want or become. She had read the notices in the newspaper about opportunities in the expanding territories and states of the West, land that was cheap and work that was available, and a general sense that the old conventions were looser, and newer ones had not yet calcified into permanence. A friend of a friend had mentioned Harlan Creek, Texas, specifically. A small community growing around the ranching trade, in need of a schoolteacher now that the previous one had married a cattle broker and moved to San Antonio. The arrangement was loose and informal, as such things tended to be in 1882 Texas, but the town council had written to inquire, and she had written back to accept. And so here she was, sitting on a broken wagon on a Texas road in the full heat of a May afternoon, waiting for a man with gray-green eyes to come back with a draft team and a rope. He was as good as his word. In slightly under 20 minutes she heard the sound of heavy hooves and the jingle of harness, and Clayton Archer came back down the road with a pair of big work horses, a coiled rope over his saddle horn, and a young Mexican man of perhaps 17 or 18 riding behind him on a mule. "This is Tomás," Clayton said as he swung down. "He works for me. Good with horses and better with a rope." "Señorita," Tomás said politely, and touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Tomás," Fannie said with equal courtesy. Between Clayton and Tomás, with Fannie holding Pearl's head and keeping her calm, they managed to rig the rope beneath the damaged axle in such a way that it took some of the weight, then hitched the work horses to the front of the wagon and led the whole assembly slowly and carefully back up the road, through the gate, and across the pasture to the barn. It was slow work, and it took the better part of an hour, and by the time the wagon was settled in the barn's wide central aisle, the afternoon light had turned amber and long. Clayton rolled up his sleeves further, called for a wooden spoke from a rack on the barn wall where several were stored in different sizes, and went to work with a set of tools that were worn with use and very precisely organized. Fannie watched him work with a practical interest, asking occasional questions about the process, to which he gave thoughtful and accurate answers. "You have done this before," she observed. "Dozens of times. Ranch wagon wheels take a beating." "I learned from my father and he learned from his. He was working the broken spoke free as he spoke, his movements economical and sure. You said you were heading to Harlan Creek. What takes you there?" "I have been engaged to teach school." He paused very briefly, then continued working. "I heard they were looking. Sutton girl left in February. Do you have children in the school?" "No." She noticed that his answer was short and she did not press it. There were many reasons a man of 30 might have no children in the school, and she was not the kind of woman who made assumptions. "Do you have family at the ranch?" she asked instead, meaning to ask it in a general way that he could answer as he chose. "No," he said again, and then, as if he felt the brevity might seem rude, he added, "It was my father's ranch. He died 4 years ago. My mother went back east to her sister after that. It is just me now and Tomás and 2 other hands. I am sorry about your father. He had a good run. He had worked the broken spoke free and was now fitting the new one, testing the fit with careful hands. How about you? You said Bishop. Is there a Mr. Bishop?" "There was," she said. "He died in 1880, a fever. I am sorry." "We were not well suited," she said with the directness that was her natural register. "I am sorry he died, because no one should die at 31, but I will not pretend it was a happy marriage." He looked up at her then briefly, something like respect or at least attention in those gray-green eyes. Then he went back to the spoke. "That is an honest answer," he said. I find honest answers save time." He almost smiled again, that same almost smile from earlier, and went back to his work. By the time the wheel was repaired, the spokes tight and the rim straightened over a forge fire that Tamaz had lit in the corner of the barn for the purpose, the sun was gone, and the sky outside the open barn doors was the deep luminous blue of a Texas evening just after sunset. Stars were beginning to appear, and the air had cooled quickly the way prairie air did. Clayton wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the repaired wheel with the critical eye of a craftsman. Then he rolled the wagon forward and back a few feet to test it. "That will do," he said. "I would give the rim a day before you trust it to rough road, though." Fannie looked at him. "A day? The metal is still warm from the forge. Give it until tomorrow morning to fully seat." She considered this. The alternative was to drive the 3 miles to Harlan Creek on a freshly repaired wheel in the dark on unfamiliar road, which seemed unwise, or to sleep in the wagon in this man's barn, which was possible but which felt like an imposition she had not anticipated. Before she could work through these logistics aloud, Clayton said, "There is a spare room in the house. You are welcome to use it. I will have Tamaz's wife, Lucia, make up the bed." Looked at him. He said it plainly and without ulterior implication, the way a man offers a reasonable solution to a practical problem. "That is very kind," she said. "I do not want to put anyone out. Lucia will not mind. She lives in the small house at the back of the property with Tamaz and their baby. She will be glad of the chance to be useful, if you know what I mean. She is a sociable woman." "Then I accept and I thank you." Tamaz's wife Lucia was, in fact, exactly as described. She was a small, quick-moving woman of about 20 with bright black eyes, and an infant son named Raphael on her hip who regarded Fannie with the solemn, assessing gaze that very young children and very old cats sometimes deploy. Lucia made up the spare room with clean sheets that smelled of cedar and lavender, brought a pitcher of water and a clean cloth for washing, and invited Fannie to supper with such genuine warmth that Fannie found her carefully maintained composure softening slightly at the edges. Supper was beans and cornbread and dried beef stewed tender with onions, and the 4 of them, Clayton, Fannie, Lucia, and Tamaz with the baby in his lap, ate at the long kitchen table in the yellow light of a kerosene lamp. The conversation moved naturally between practical matters and occasional humor, and Fannie found herself paying attention to Clayton Archer in a way she had not quite expected. He was quiet but not withdrawn. He listened with the kind of whole attention that some people could not manage, the kind that made you feel that what you were saying was actually being heard. He had opinions and expressed them plainly, without the need to dress them up or perform confidence he did not feel. He laughed at Tamaz's stories about the cattle and the strange behavior of a new bull they had recently acquired, named Don Perdido for his habit of wandering into the most inconvenient places, with a full and genuine laugh that did something interesting to the geometry of his face. He refilled her water cup without being asked when she had drunk it down, and he did it without comment or ceremony, and she noticed that too. After supper he showed her where the well was, and where the privy was, and where to put her horse for the night. All of this information delivered with a practical decency that she found more comfortable than elaborate courtesy would have been. Then he said good night and went to his room, and she went to hers. She lay awake for a while in the spare room, listening to the sounds of the Texas night, coyotes at a distance, the creak of the house settling in the cooler air, the occasional low complaint of cattle somewhere in the dark. The mattress was harder than she was accustomed to, and the pillow smelled faintly of cedar from the chest it had presumably been stored in, and she felt, despite everything, more settled than she had since leaving Georgia. In the morning she woke to the sound of someone, Lucia probably, moving around the kitchen and the smell of coffee. She dressed carefully, pinned her dark hair up with her customary precision, and went out to find that the sun was barely up and Clayton was already in the barn, checking the wheel on her wagon. "Good morning," she said from the barn doorway. He looked up. "Good morning. Coffee is on. Lucia will have breakfast ready in about an hour." He went back to the wheel, crouching to examine it. "It's settled well overnight. You should have no trouble on the road to town." She came forward and crouched beside him to look at the wheel herself. "How can you tell?" He showed her, pointing out the seating of the spoke and the way the rim had set as it cooled. It was a clear, practical explanation, and she followed it without difficulty. "You are curious about how things work," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, is that unusual in a woman?" "Around here, somewhat. I have never found curiosity to be a quality that ought to be restricted by category," she said. He looked at her sideways from his crouching position. "No," he said, as if agreeing with something he had already been thinking. "I expect you have not." They had breakfast together, the four of them again with the solemn baby Raphael, and the conversation was easy in the morning light. Fannie found out that Clayton had been running the Archer ranch, which was called the Double A in the local parlance, though the sign on the gate simply said Archer, for nearly a decade before his father died, having come home from 2 years studying at a college in Austin to find that his father's health was declining and the ranch needed steady management. He had never gone back to finish the degree and did not seem to regret it particularly. "What did you study?" she asked. "Natural sciences and land management, useful for a rancher as it turned out." He looked faintly amused by the irony. "I learned more here, though. Most people do in the end." "Were you always a teacher?" "I wanted to be a doctor," she said, and this came out with a flatness that indicated it was a thing she had made peace with but did not take lightly. There was not a realistic path to that for a woman from a middle-class Georgia family in 1873. Teaching was the nearest available alternative. "I am good at it. I like the children." She paused. "But I will not pretend it was entirely my first choice." Something in his face shifted, the same shift she had seen the day before when she had spoken plainly about her marriage. Not pity. Something more like recognition, the look of a person who understands that other people also carry the shapes of what might have been. "Do you think Texas will be different?" he asked. "I think the West has been different for some people," she said carefully. "Whether it will be different for me remains to be seen." He nodded. "That is a fair answer." After breakfast, she helped Lucia clear the table over Lucia's protestations that she was a guest and should sit. And while they washed up together, Lucia leaned in close with a sparkle in her eyes and whispered, in the mix of Spanish and English that she used when she was being confidential, that Mr. Archer had not looked at a woman the way he looked at Fannie in longer than Lucia could remember, maybe ever, and that she hoped Fannie was planning to stay in Harlan Creek for a good long while. Fannie felt the warmth rise to her face, which happened rarely, and murmured something noncommittal, and Lucia laughed in a way that suggested she found the noncommittal response very committal indeed. Before she left, Clayton walked out with her to where Pearl was hitched to the repaired wagon. He had checked the harness for her, checking each buckle and strap with the same careful attention he gave everything, and she had stood beside him and checked the other side, because she was not the kind of woman who let other people do her work for her entirely, even when they were being kind. "I owe you for the spoke and the labor," she said. "I have money." "You do not owe me anything," he said. "I do, and I prefer to settle debts." He looked at her steadily. "The spoke was spare wood that I had on hand and would not have used otherwise. The labor was an hour of my evening. Consider it a welcome to the county." "That is generous." "It is practical," he said. "Harlan Creek needs a school teacher. The quicker you get there in good repair, the quicker the children get their school back." She looked at him for a moment. "That is a very practical way to describe generosity." "I am a practical man," he said, and there was just the faintest trace of something in his voice, some awareness, that told her he knew perfectly well that he was also being generous and was simply choosing not to use the word. "Well," she said, "thank you, Clayton Archer, for the wheel and the supper and the room and the breakfast." "Safe travels, Fannie Bishop," he said. "The road forks about a mile ahead. Take the left fork." She nodded, stepped up onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and looked back at him once. He was standing in the yard with his hands easy at his sides, squinting slightly in the morning sun, and there was something in his expression that she thought she would think about later, in a quiet moment, and probably would not tell anyone about. She drove away and did not look back again, because she had found over the years that looking back was an indulgence best reserved for very significant occasions. Harlan Creek turned out to be exactly as advertised. It was a small town, perhaps 300 people, built along both sides of a creek that was running with reasonable confidence in the May rains. There was a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a hotel of modest aspiration, a saloon, a church, and several other establishments that filled the practical needs of a ranching community. Clara Petch was indeed a widow woman, and she did indeed have a room to let and good cooking, and she also had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, which Fannie found bracing rather than oppressive. The schoolhouse was a single rectangular building at the east end of town, with a bell above the door that worked, and a potbelly stove inside that Clara informed her would be absolutely essential by October. There were 22 children enrolled, ranging from age 6 to 14, and Fannie met them all on the Friday of her first week, when she held an informal session to introduce herself and assess where they were in their studies. The children were, on the whole, bright and curious and rough around the edges in the way of children who spent a great deal of time outdoors and had been through several teachers in the past 2 years. They tested her, as children will, and she passed every test with the calm confidence of someone who was not frightened of them, which they seemed to find both surprising and appealing. She also, on that first Friday, found out from Clara that the Double-A Ranch belonged to a man named Clayton Archer, and that he was considered a steady and honest and somewhat solitary member of the Harlan Creek community, respected by his neighbors and the subject of occasional matchmaking speculation from the mothers of unmarried daughters, none of which had come to anything. "Is he well regarded?" Fannie asked, in a tone she hoped was merely inquiring. "As well as anyone I know," Clara said. "He is fair with his workers, pays his debts, and does not drink himself stupid or beat his horse." She paused over the biscuits she was rolling. "In this country, those qualities put a man in the top third without needing anything else." Fannie laughed, which was something she had not done quite freely in some time, and helped Clara set the table. She had been in Harlan Creek for 11 days when she saw Clayton Archer again. It was a Saturday morning, and she had gone to the general store for chalk and a composition book, and he was there buying iron nails and a length of rope and a pair of work gloves. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, across the narrow width of the store's interior, and the expression that crossed his face before he could organize it into something more considered was one she categorized privately as pleased. "Miss Bishop," he said, and then seemed to remember that she had introduced herself as Mrs. Bishop, that being her legal name, and corrected himself. "Mrs. Bishop, how is the wagon holding?" "Perfectly well," she said. "You do good work." "Thank you. How is the school?" "Coming along. They are a bright group with some gaps in their foundation. We are addressing those." "Good." He turned his hat in his hands briefly, which she recognized as a gesture that meant he was thinking something more than he was saying. "The county has a social on Saturday evenings, over at the Grange Hall. I do not go most times, but I have been told it is pleasant if you enjoy that kind of thing." He was telling her about a social event in a manner that was not quite an invitation and not quite merely information. She understood the particular challenge of a man who was not practiced at this. "What kind of thing is it?" she asked. "Dancing, some music, people talking, nothing elaborate." "That sounds like exactly the kind of thing I would enjoy," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Would you like to go? Tonight, I mean." "I would," she said. "I could meet you at Mrs. Petch's at 7 if that suits." "That suits." He paid for his nails and rope and gloves, and she paid for her chalk and composition book, and they left the store at the same time and went their separate ways, and she walked back to Clara's boarding house with a lightness in her step that she recognized as anticipation, and decided she did not need to apologize for. Clara, when informed of the Saturday social, immediately produced opinions about what Fannie ought to wear, which of her two presentable dresses was more flattering, whether she should wear her hair differently, and what was known about Clayton Archer's character, emotional availability, and general suitability as a companion, all of which she delivered without any apparent awareness that she had not been asked for most of it. Fannie bore this with affection and a certain amount of private amusement, and chose the blue dress herself on the grounds that it was more comfortable. He was at the door of Clara's boarding house at 2 minutes before 7, which told her something about him. He had changed his clothes, wearing a clean dark shirt and trousers that were not his working clothes, and he had shaved, which told her something more. He held the door of the Grange hall open for her, and brought her a cup of lemonade without asking if she wanted one, which she did, and introduced her to the people she had not yet met in the way of a man who was comfortable in his own community, even if he did not dominate it. The music was 3 men, a fiddle, a guitar, and a man playing a type of small concertina, and they were genuinely good, the kind of good that makes dancing feel inevitable rather than obligatory. The hall was warm with kerosene light, and the cheerful noise of perhaps 40 people in a space built for 30, and there was something in the quality of the air, the laughter, the scrape of boots on the wooden floor, the smell of tobacco and lemonade and women's rose water, that made Fannie feel, for the first time in a long time, that she had arrived somewhere. She danced with Clayton twice, and on the second dance, which was a slower waltz that the fiddle player handled with unexpected grace, she found that he danced well, not showily but with a quiet sureness that she appreciated. He held her at a proper distance but with a hand at her waist that was firm and steady, and he did not look over her shoulder at other things while they danced, which some men did, but looked at her. "You have been here 11 days, he said, 12 counting today. Do you like it?" She considered. "I like the children. I like the country, which I did not expect to like as much as I do. I like Mrs. Petch, even though she has opinions about everything." He smiled at that, a full smile this time, not the almost smile she had catalogued before, and it altered his face considerably. "She does. She told my father once that he planted his east field in the wrong rotation for 4 years before he listened to her. She was right, as it turned out. She usually is, I suspect. Yes." He turned her around a corner of the dance floor with careful hands. "What do you dislike? About Harlan Creek? About any of it?" She thought about that. "The noise of men in the saloon at night carries further than I would prefer, and the lack of a proper library is a genuine inconvenience." "Saloon will not improve," he said, "but there is a collection of books at the church that the Reverend lends out, and I have several crates in my study that I have not read in some time and would not object to lending." She looked up at him. "That is a very practical form of generosity again." "It is entirely self-interested," he said, and his voice was warm with something that was not quite humor but lived next door to it. "If you are reading my books, you have a reason to come back to the ranch." She felt the warmth in her face again, that particular warmth, and held his gaze. "Is that so?" "It might be," he said. After the social, he walked her back to Clara's boarding house through the warm May night, and they walked slowly in no particular hurry, and talked about the natural sciences he had studied in Austin, and the medical texts she had read on her own over the years, and the observation that the stars over Texas were, in fact, bigger in the sense of being more visible than the stars over Georgia, probably because the air was drier and the tree cover was sparser. At Clara's door he stopped and turned his hat in his hands, and she waited. "I was thinking of riding out to the east pasture tomorrow to check the water levels in the creek," he said. "If you wanted to ride along. For the air." "For the air," she said. "And the company," he added, with a directness that seemed to have cost him something. "I would like that," she said. "What time?" "After church, if you go to church. About 11. I will be ready at 11. He nodded, put his hat back on, and walked away down the street, and she went inside and up to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment before lighting the lamp, just sitting with the particular quality of the evening, which felt like the beginning of something. She did not sleep badly. The Sunday ride was the first of many. They rode out along the creek, which was running fuller than Clayton had expected given the season, and he explained to her, with the precision and evident pleasure of a man who loves his land and understands it, about the water table and the spring rains and what it meant for the summer grazing. She asked good questions, the kind that built on what he had said rather than simply circling back to the same point, and he answered them fully. He showed her the section of the creek where the bank had been reinforced with planted grasses 2 years ago after an erosion problem, and the cottonwood grove where a pair of great horned owls had nested for the past 3 years, and the low ridge from which, on a clear day, you could see the faint haze that he said was the town of Caldwell, 30 miles east. She told him about Georgia, about her father who had farmed cotton and her mother who had died of cholera when Fannie was 7, about the school in Macon and the children she had taught there, and the particular satisfaction of watching a child suddenly comprehend something that had been opaque to them, the way their face changed in that moment. "It is the closest thing to what I imagine surgery feels like," she said. "The precise moment when something that was not working begins to work." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that indicated she had said something that connected with something in him. "That is a very specific kind of joy," he said. "To be the instrument of that. Yes, do you feel it with the land?" He was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering. "Something like it, when you put something into the earth and the earth gives it back to you transformed. There is a particular feeling in that." "There is," she said. They were sitting on the low ridge by then, their horses grazing nearby, and the afternoon had gone golden and still the way Texas afternoons went, everything slowed and luminous, and she was aware that something was shifting between them in a direction that was increasingly, irreversibly clear. "Fannie," he said. "Yes. I want to be plain with you because I think you prefer plainness." "I do." He was looking out at the hazy distance, and then he turned and looked at her directly. "I have been alone on this ranch for 4 years. I'm not lonely in the way of a man who cannot stand his own company, but I am lonely in the way of a man who has found that there are things that are better shared, and has not until recently found the right person to share them with." He stopped. "I am not proposing anything. I am telling you where I am, so you can decide where you are with full information." She looked at him for a long time. The late afternoon light was in his hair and on the angles of his face, and he was watching her with a steadiness that she found deeply comfortable, the steadiness of a man who would not flinch from whatever she said. "I am in an unfamiliar place," she said carefully, "with an unfamiliar person, and I am finding both considerably more appealing than I anticipated. I am not a woman who moves quickly, and I have reasons for that caution that I will not pretend are not real." She paused. "But I am here, and I would like to go on being here, and I would like to continue this, whatever it is, at a pace that allows us both to know what we are doing." He nodded. "That is all I am asking." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "I think we do," he said. They rode back to town in the long evening light, and the conversation was easier for having been had, the way clearing the air always made a room feel larger. May turned to June, and the Texas heat became serious, the kind of heat that has weight and intention. Fannie settled into her rhythm at the school with increasing confidence. She had identified which children needed extra attention in reading, which ones had a gift for numbers, and which ones needed more physical activity in the day or they could not sit still long enough to learn anything. She arranged her school day accordingly, and the results were measurable within a few weeks. She also engaged, early in June, in a spirited argument with the chairman of the town council, a large and self-important man named Aldous Pratt, who had decided that her curriculum was too ambitious, specifically the inclusion of science lessons and geography lessons beyond the immediate region, which he called unnecessary and potentially unsettling. "What is unsettling about geography?" she asked him in his office above the general store, with a directness that clearly made him uncomfortable. "Children in a ranching community do not need to know the names of rivers in South America," he said. Children in a ranching community need to know how to think, she said. Geography teaches them that the world is large and that their place in it has a context. These are not unsettling ideas. They are foundational ones. Pratt was a man accustomed to having the final word and was not pleased. He told her that the school board would review the curriculum, which was a threat of a kind, though a relatively mild one. She told Clayton about it that evening when he had come into town to collect a delivery at the general store and stopped by the schoolhouse, as he had taken to doing when in town. Pratt is a man who measures his importance by what he can prevent, Clayton said, not particularly heated, but with the flat certainty of a man stating a fact. He will review the curriculum and find nothing to fault and let it go. What if he doesn't? Then you will have the support of most of the parents in the county, because their children come home talking about what they learned and wanting to learn more, and that is not something parents generally object to. He paused. You also have mine for what it is worth. She looked at him. You are not a parent. No, but I am a tax-paying resident of the county who attended this school myself, and I have opinions about its quality. She was quiet for a moment, unexpectedly touched by this, in a way that had something to do with the matter-of-fact way he said it. She had fought most of her battles alone, and the small weight of someone else's support was something she had forgotten could be offered. Thank you, she said. It is entirely self-interested, he said, with that same barely there warmth. A good school produces better neighbors. You keep using self-interest as a reason for kind behavior. I find it more honest than claiming pure altruism. She laughed, genuinely, and he smiled at her with the full smile that she had now catalogued as one of the better things in her daily experience. In the middle of June, there was a problem with the Double A's cattle. A sickness moving through one of the herds that Clayton suspected was related to a contaminated water source in the south pasture. He rode out with Tamaz every morning before the heat set in to check and move cattle and check the water, and he was visibly tired the 2 or 3 evenings a week when he came into town, dark circles under those gray-green eyes. Fannie went out to the ranch on a Saturday with the offer to help in whatever way was useful. He looked surprised when she rode up. You do not need to be here, he said. I know I do not need to be. I want to be. Tell me what I can do. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. He put her to work with Lucia, preparing the mixture of salt and clean water that they were using to treat the mildly affected cattle, a practical remedy that he had read about and had already shown some results. It was hot, dusty, repetitive work, and she did it steadily for 4 hours without complaint. At mid-afternoon, when they had stopped to rest in the shade of the barn, he brought her a cup of water and sat down beside her on an upturned crate, not quite touching but close. You are not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? A schoolteacher from Georgia. I expected someone more. He considered. Delicate. She snorted, which was not a very decorous sound but came naturally. I grew up on a farm. My father had no sons. I have plowed a field and delivered calves and patched a roof. I believe you. Good. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pasture where Tamaz was moving cattle. The sickness is getting better. 3 more days and I think we will have it contained. Good. Thank you for coming out today. You are welcome. He reached over briefly and put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. Not grasping, just resting. And then he took it away and went back to looking at the cattle, and she sat with the warmth of that gesture for a long time after it was gone. By July, they had become a fixture in each other's lives in the way that happens when 2 people are both willing to be honest, and neither one is trying to perform a version of themselves that is not real. He rode into town several evenings a week, and she rode out to the ranch on Saturdays when she could, and they talked with the ease of people who had found in each other the specific pleasure of conversation that did not require management. He was teaching her to rope, because she had expressed interest in learning, and he had no particular reason to refuse a person who wanted to learn a skill. She was teaching him, or rather reteaching him, the natural history she had absorbed from the books he had lent her. in the way that explaining something to someone else illuminated it for both of them. She had also, quietly, become useful in the community in ways that went beyond the schoolroom. She had some medical knowledge, self-taught but substantial, and when the blacksmith's apprentice cut his hand badly in the third week of July, it was Fannie who cleaned and sutured the wound while the local doctor, a man of 60 named Dr. Whitmore, was 2 days' ride away visiting relatives. She did it calmly and correctly, and Dr. Whitmore confirmed when he returned that it had been well done. Word of this got around in the way of small towns, and several women came to her in subsequent weeks with the kind of problems they were reluctant to take to Dr. Whitmore, questions about pregnancy and childbirth and children's ailments, and she answered them carefully and from knowledge, and sent them to Dr. Whitmore when the situation warranted it, and the women of the community began to regard her with the particular warmth they reserved for people who were genuinely useful. Aldous Pratt did eventually call the curriculum review he had threatened. It happened in late July, in the church hall on a Tuesday evening, and Fannie stood before the 5-member school board and presented her curriculum clearly and precisely, laying out not only what she was teaching but why, with specific examples of what the children had achieved. 3 of the 5 board members were clearly already convinced before she finished. A 4th came around during the presentation. Pratt voted against, as she had expected, and was overruled 4-1. Clayton was in the church hall for the meeting, along with perhaps a third of the town. He had sat in the back with his hat in his hands and listened with attention, and when it was over he came forward and said simply, "Well done. The children did the work," she said. "I just showed the board what they had produced. That is good teaching," he said. She looked at him, and in the warm lantern light of the church hall with the noise of the town around them, she felt something shift in her chest, something that had been careful and measured and cautious shifting toward something more certain, and she thought that she had perhaps been more cautious than was necessary and it might be time to say so. "Clayton," she said. "Yes. I think I am falling in love with you." The noise of the hall seemed to recede somewhat. He was looking at her with an expression that was very still and very intent, and she met it without flinching, which was, she thought, the appropriate response to saying a true thing. "I have been in love with you," he said, with the same flat and precise tone he used for things he was entirely certain about, "since you crouched down and looked at that broken wheel with me and asked an intelligent question about the spoke." "That was the first morning," she said. "That was very early." "Yes," he said, "it was." She felt the smile come up in her face, genuine and wide and with no effort to moderate it. He smiled back, the full smile, and in the warm, crowded church hall of Harlan Creek, Texas, on a Tuesday evening in July of 1882, Fannie Bishop and Clayton Archer looked at each other and knew with the certainty that rarely announces itself but is unmistakable when it arrives, that this was real and it was going somewhere, and it was going to be all right. August arrived with a sustained and muscular heat that the locals accepted philosophically, and that Fannie had been warned about but which was still impressive in its completeness. Everything shimmered and the sky was a flat and luminous blue from horizon to horizon, and the creek dropped to a trickle by mid-month, which concerned the ranchers but was not, Clayton told her, unusual for August. He had taken to having Sunday dinners with her at Clara's boarding house, which Clara had encouraged with enthusiasm and facilitated by producing increasingly elaborate meals, and then finding reasons to be elsewhere after they had been served. This delicacy was not unappreciated. One Sunday in early August, over cold roast chicken and corn on the cob and a peach pie that Clara had made with the last of the season's peaches, Clayton produced a book from the inside pocket of his jacket. It was a fairly thick volume with a green cloth cover. "This came with the last delivery from the bookshop in Abilene," he said, setting it on the table beside her plate. "I ordered it because I thought you would find it useful." She looked at the title. It was a medical text, recent, published in 1880, dealing with practical medicine and basic surgical procedures. She picked it up and looked at him. "You ordered this for me, Doctor." Whitmore is 60 years old and does not always have a reliable replacement, he said. Having someone else in the county with a solid foundation seems sensible. That is extraordinarily self-interested, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. It is, he agreed, and his voice had the warmth in it, the full warmth, not the barely there version. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, reversing the gesture he had made in the barn, and he turned his hand over and held hers properly. And they sat like that for a moment, the book between them and the peach pie cooling and the August sun coming through Clara's lace curtains in bars of gold. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the future, about what it looks like. Tell me." "I think it involves the ranch and the school and the county," he said in the tone of a man laying out a careful plan. "I think it involves you staying, not as a visitor and not as a person accommodated, but as a person who belongs here." He paused. "I think it involves asking you when the time is right to marry me if you are open to that possibility." "When the time is right," she said. "I do not want to rush you." "You were cautious about rushing and you had good reasons." She looked at him. The afternoon was very still and warm, and Clara's canary was singing in its cage by the window, and everything felt very clear. "Clayton," she said, "the time is right." He looked at her very directly. "Are you sure?" "I would not say it if I was not sure. You know that about me." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and what was in his face was so unguarded and genuine that she felt her chest tighten with it. "Fannie Bishop," he said. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed them to her knuckles, and it was the most dignified and meaningful gesture she had ever received. "Good," he said. And then, with the warmth fully in his voice, without the restraint he usually kept on it, "I am very glad." "So am I," she said. "Very." Clara, when informed, produced sherry from a locked cabinet that Fanny had not known existed, poured 3 glasses, and gave a toast that covered 3 minutes and included references to God, to Texas, to the sanctity of good cooking, and to her own judgment of character, which she characterized as impeccable. Then she cried briefly in a manner she clearly intended to be private and was not, and the evening became a celebration without particularly meaning to. They set the date for October, after the summer heat had broken and before the weather became difficult. A fall wedding, Clara declared, was the best kind, and she intended to have opinions about every aspect of it, and she did. September brought the beginning of the school year's second session, and the cooler air, and a period of sustained happiness that Fanny had not quite known to expect. She had been content before, had worked hard and found satisfaction in it, but happiness, the particular kind that comes from being known and chosen by a specific person, was different in a way she had not fully understood until she had it. She and Clayton were not given to public displays, which suited them both, but the whole town could see them on Sunday evenings walking by the creek, or on Saturday mornings looking at the seed catalogs that had begun to arrive from Abilene and discussing the garden she intended to plant in the spring. The women of the community approved heartily, and the men regarded Clayton with the particular respect they reserved for someone who had secured a prize that most of them had not even had the sense to notice was available. There were practical things to arrange. She would move to the ranch after the wedding, which meant the school needed to be addressable from the ranch, and the ranch road, Clayton assured her, was passable in all but the worst weather. He was building a proper study for her in the ranch house, a room with good windows and a long table for her books and papers, and she went out on a Saturday in mid-September and stood in the unfinished room with sawdust on the floor and late afternoon light coming through the frame where the window would go, and felt such a deep, uncomplicated sense of rightness that she stood there for a full minute just breathing it. He came and stood behind her, not touching but close, and said, "Is it what you wanted?" "It is exactly what I wanted," she said. "How did you know?" "You told me what you needed. I listened." She turned and looked at him. "You are a remarkably good listener. You are a remarkably clear speaker," he said. "It helps." She reached up and touched his face, something she had not done before, touching his cheek with the back of her hand in a gesture that was tender and deliberate, and he went very still under it, as still as an animal that does not want to startle away something good. "I am going to be very happy here," she said. "I intend to see to it," he said quietly. And he put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the unfinished room with the sawdust and the window light and the smell of fresh-cut pine, and were, for a moment, entirely still. The wedding was on the second Saturday of October, in the white church on Main Street with the bell that worked, officiated by the Reverend Thomas Cole, a thin, energetic man who took genuine pleasure in weddings and performed them with both solemnity and warmth. Clara had organized flowers, dahlias and late sunflowers from her own garden, and had taken charge of the cake, a dense and spiced affair that was frankly better than the occasion required. Fannie wore a dark blue silk dress that she had brought from Georgia in the bottom of her trunk, not knowing when she would wear it but unable to leave it behind. She had worn it only once before, to a spring concert at the Macon Music Society, and it had seemed too formal for her daily life ever since. It was not too formal for this. Clayton, in a dark coat and pressed shirt, was waiting at the front of the church and turned to look at her when she came through the door. And the look on his face was the kind that a woman carries with her for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic or spectacular, but because it was entirely real, the look of a man who sees the person he wants to spend his life with walking toward him and is grateful in a way that runs deeper than words. Tamaz and Lucia were there with Raphael, who sat on his father's lap and observed the proceedings with his customary solemnity. Many of the town's families were there, parents of her students, neighbors of Clayton's, Clara Petch in her Sunday best with fresh tears already threatening, Dr. Whitmore looking on with benevolent approval. They said their vows in the plain and direct language of the time, and when Clayton slid the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, she felt the weight of it as the comfortable weight of something that fit, not a constraint but an anchor. Reverend Cole pronounced them man and wife, and Clayton kissed her with the same quiet sureness that characterized everything he did, and she kissed him back with none of the restraint she had been maintaining for months, and the church made the kind of noise that churches make when people are genuinely happy about what they are witnessing. The celebration afterward was at the Grange Hall, the same hall where they had danced that first Saturday in May, and the same 3 musicians played, and the dancing went on until late, and Fannie danced with her husband, who danced with the same quiet sureness as always, and she thought about that first dance, the careful distance and the firm hand at her waist, and how the same man could feel so different once you knew him. "What are you thinking?" he asked as they turned in a slow circle on the mostly cleared dance floor. "I am thinking about the first time we danced here," she said. "May, you held me at exactly the proper distance." "I was trying very hard not to hold you improperly," he said, with a gravity that was only partially in earnest. She laughed. "I noticed the effort. Did you know then?" She considered. "I thought you were the kind of man who would be worth knowing very well," she said. "I did not know yet that I would have the chance." He held her a little less at the proper distance now that the propriety was no longer the operative concern, and said, "You have the chance." "I know," she said. "I am very glad of it." They left the Grange Hall at 10 and drove back to the ranch under a full October moon, the kind of moon that turns the prairie to silver and makes the shadows long and sharp, and Pearl trotted steadily in the harness, and the night air was cool and smelled of autumn and dry grass, and Clayton's arm was around her shoulders, and Fannie Bishop, who was now Fannie Archer, felt the whole shape of her future spreading out before her like good land, and was not afraid of any of it. Lucia had laid a fire in the bedroom fireplace and left wildflowers on the dresser, which made Fannie feel seen in a way that brought sudden moisture to her eyes. Clayton saw it and put his arms around her from behind and said nothing, which was the right response. The winter was long and occasionally fierce, the way Texas winters could be, and the ranch was a busy place even in the cold months, with the care of the cattle and the maintenance of the buildings and the constant practical demands of a working property. Fannie continued at the school, driving the ranch road in the mornings and back in the afternoons, and on the days when the road was iced or mudded, she stayed at Clara's, which Clara facilitated with the pleasure of a woman who preferred her boarding house not to be empty. She had her study by then, fully completed, with windows that let in the low winter light, and the long table she had wanted, and the books in their rows and her medical texts in their own section, which she read in the evenings when Clayton was reading or doing accounts, the two of them on opposite sides of the fireplace in a companionable silence that was one of the things she had not known to value and now valued enormously. She also began, that winter, to act as an informal assistant to Dr. Whitmore on cases that came through, with his blessing and encouragement. He was a generous man who recognized her competence without feeling threatened by it, which was not a universal quality in men of his profession, and he taught her what he could, and she taught him what she had learned from her reading, and they got on very well. In February, Fannie realized, with the practical certainty of a woman with substantial medical knowledge, that she was pregnant. She told Clayton on a Sunday morning, sitting across the kitchen table from him over coffee, with the February light coming through the window and the smell of wood smoke in the air. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and said, "How are you feeling?" "Very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise well. You will tell me if that changes." "I will tell you." He looked down at her hands in his and then back up at her, and what was in his face was the same unguarded thing she had seen in August in Clara's parlor and on their wedding day, and in the moments between moments when he did not know she was watching. Joy quiet and deep, the kind that does not need to be performed. "A child," he said, as if saying the word made it more real. "A child," she agreed. He brought her hands up and held them against his chest for a moment, and she felt his heartbeat under her palms, steady and strong and a little faster than usual. They told Lucia and Tamaz that afternoon, and Lucia screamed with delight and embraced Fannie with genuine and unself-conscious warmth, and Tamaz shook Clayton's hand with the gravity of one man acknowledging another's good fortune. Raphael, who was now walking and had developed strong opinions about everything, regarded the general excitement with his usual solemnity, and then returned to the important business of trying to catch one of the barn cats. Spring came again, the second spring since Fannie had driven that wagon across Clayton's pasture, and the ranch was greener than usual after the winter rains. She planted her garden in April, with Clayton's help and Tamaz's engineering, a proper kitchen garden behind the house with raised beds for vegetables and herbs, and a corner for the medicinal plants she wanted on hand for her work with Dr. Whitmore. She was visibly pregnant by June, and the summer was warm and full of work and easy days, the school out for summer and her time her own, except for the growing demands of the pregnancy and the ranch and the community work she had taken on. She rode less and walked more, and Clayton was attentive without being hovering, which was a fine line. She appreciated him walking correctly. Clara came out to the ranch for long Sunday visits and brought opinions about everything related to the pregnancy and the upcoming birth, most of which were not medically sound, and Fannie listened with affection and redirected them where necessary with the tact she had learned for these situations. Dr. Whitmore examined her twice in the summer and declared her in excellent health and expected no complications. "You are sturdy," he said, which was not the most elegant compliment but was meant sincerely. The baby came in mid-October, on a cool, bright afternoon, just over a year after the wedding. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair, and from the first moments unmistakably his father's gray-green eyes. They named him Samuel James Archer, for Clayton's father and for Fannie's, and Fannie held him in the spare room that had briefly housed her on the night of the broken wheel, and thought about the strange, precise logic of how things happened, the spoke that had sheared through at exactly the right moment on exactly the right road, and the man who had come across his pasture at a canter to investigate an unexpected visitor. Clayton was there for the birth, which was not universally the practice but which he had stated his intention to be and had carried through, sitting on a chair by the bed and holding her hand with a steadiness that she had needed and that he had provided without drama or self-congratulation. When Dr. Whitmore put the baby into his arms, the expression on Clayton's face was one she knew she would carry for the rest of her life, even longer than the look in the church doorway. "He looks like you," she said from the pillow. "He has your mouth," Clayton said, not looking up from the baby's face. "That is lucky for him." "Why?" "You have a very good mouth," he said simply, and she laughed, which she had not expected to be able to do at that particular moment, and which felt wonderful. By the time Samuel was 3 months old and the early winter was settling over the prairie, the ranch felt completely full in a way it had not been for years. Lucia and Tamaz had a second child on the way, and the small house at the back was cheerfully noisy. And Clara came every Sunday and had all but informally adopted the Archer family as her own, which suited everyone involved. Fannie was back at the school by February, with Samuel in a basket in the corner of the schoolroom, which the children found enormously pleasing, and which made the school day somewhat more complicated in interesting ways. She had negotiated with the town council for a small room in the schoolhouse where Lucia could look after Samuel during school hours in exchange for a modest wage, which solved the logistical problem and gave Lucia income and companionship besides. Aldous Pratt had objected on principle and had been overruled 5-0, which had become his primary function at school board meetings. The years that followed had the quality of good work done alongside good people, the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories but build the substance of a life. The school grew from 22 students to 31 by the time Samuel started attending. Fannie's medical practice, informal and unlicensed but recognized and valued by the community, expanded alongside Dr. Whitmore's aging practice until the old man retired in 1886 and wrote a letter to the County Board of Health recommending Fannie Archer as the most competent medical practitioner in the county, credentials and convention notwithstanding. This was not without its difficulties. A woman practicing medicine in rural Texas in 1886 was not universally accepted, and there were people who would have preferred their ailments addressed by a man with the right paper, even if the paper came with less knowledge. Fannie addressed these objections one patient at a time, by being correct and precise and unhurried in her care, and by not making them feel foolish for their hesitation. Clayton was her most consistent advocate, matter of fact in the way he always was, telling anyone who would listen that his wife was the best doctor within 50 miles and the only one, and that the two facts were directly related. The double A grew in those years as well. Clayton expanded the herd, improved the water systems across the property using techniques from the agricultural journals that had begun to arrive by mail, bought out the neighboring property to the east when it came available in 1885, and brought on 2 more hands. He was a respected presence in the county now, on the Water Commission and the Land Board, known as a man whose word was solid and whose judgment was worth seeking. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet, they were still the 2 people who had crouched beside a broken wheel in a barn doorway and looked at how things worked. They still talked with that same quality of attention, still found in each other the specific pleasure of a mind that engaged genuinely with the world and did not perform for its own sake. Samuel grew into a child of remarkable energy and curiosity, exactly the combination most likely to exhaust and delight in equal measure. He had his father's steadiness underneath the energy and his mother's directness, and he was in the front row of his mother's classroom, which created its own set of dynamics that both of them navigated with amusement. A second child arrived in the spring of 1887, a girl they named Eleanor Grace Archer, called Ellie from her first week. She was a quiet baby who grew into a watchful and perceptive child, very different from her brother in temperament, and equally adored. The ranch in the spring of 1888 was in full bloom, the garden behind the house a going concern of tomatoes and beans and squash and herbs, the cottonwood grove by the creek leafing out in its particular pale green, pearl aging gracefully in the pasture, the barn full of the comfortable sounds of horses and cattle. Tamaz and Lucia were still there, with 3 children now, their family woven into the fabric of the ranch as completely as the Archers themselves. On a Saturday evening in late May of 1888, the 6th anniversary of the Saturday social at the Grange Hall where Clayton had danced with Fannie for the first time, Clayton came to find her in her study, where she was writing up notes from a patient visit earlier in the week. He leaned in the doorway in the particular way he had, easy and unhurried, watching her. She looked up and found him watching her with the expression she had come to know as its own category of love, the specific look of a person who watches someone they chose and is aware in that moment of the quality of their choice. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She put down her pen. "You have been just looking at me for 6 years. And counting," he said. She stood up from the desk and crossed the room to him, and he put his arms around her in the doorway of the study in the lamplight with the sound of the children asleep down the hall and the spring night outside the windows. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" she said into his shoulder. "Tell me." "That broken wheel," she said, "the specific moment it cracked, the sound it made." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard it from the barn," he said. "I thought it was a rifle shot, and then I thought the sound was too far away and too sharp. I told Tamaz to go check the road." She pulled back to look at him. "You sent Tamaz first. I was going to go myself, but I was already saddled and I told him to go on while I finished with the horse." He paused, "and then I saw him come back and point toward the road and I rode out myself. You almost sent Tamaz to fix my wheel." "I almost let someone else find you," he said. "I have thought about that quite a lot." She looked at him. "Do you think it would have come out differently?" "I think you would have gotten your wheel fixed regardless," he said, "because you are not a person who does not get things done. I think you would have found your way to Harlan Creek and done your work here and been good at it." He paused. "I think whether you and I would have come to find each other without that particular afternoon on the road is a question I prefer not to examine too closely." "Why?" "Because the answer might require me to be grateful for a broken wheel in a way I find uncomfortable." She laughed against his chest, and he held her closer, and outside the windows the Texas night was warm and full of stars, and the mockingbird was doing its repertoire in the cottonwood grove, and Samuel made a small sleep sound from down the hall, and Ellie would be awake at dawn and demanding, and Pearl needed her hooves checked in the morning, and the east field wanted looking at before next week's rain, and none of it was anything other than the full and certain texture of a life that was theirs. "I am glad it was you," she said, "the man on the horse." "So am I," he said, "every day." She had arrived at his ranch with a broken wheel and a straight spine, the wheel tilting the wagon into the road, and the spine carrying her across his pasture with her chin level and her carpetbag over her shoulder and her chin exactly parallel to the horizon. He had fixed the wheel, and she had straightened something in him that had been bent for years without his quite knowing it, the part of a person that believes they are worth being found, that waits without hoping too specifically, and then finds that the specific thing hoped for has arrived, announced by the sound of a gunshot that was only a spoke giving way. By the summer of 1888, the life they had made was one that both of them recognized, on the quiet evenings and the hard days alike, as the right one. Not perfect, because no life was that, and not without its difficulties, the droughts and the sick cattle and the school board and the world's continuing complicated relationship with what a woman could and ought to do, but right in the way that good land is right, that rewards the work put into it and returns something in every season, that is owned fully and known deeply, and loved not despite its imperfection but through it. Samuel would start school in September with all the turbulent enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who had been waiting for the official designation of student for at least 2 years. Ellie would walk that fall, the first tottering steps across the kitchen floor toward her father's outstretched hands, and then she would run, and then there would be no catching her. Lucia's third child, a girl named Rosa, had taken to following Fannie around the garden with the solemn purposefulness of a child who has decided that a particular adult belongs to her, and Fannie let her, and taught her the names of the plants and what they were for. Tomás had saved enough of his wages to buy a small piece of land to the south of the ranch, and Clayton had helped him file the deed, and the two men had shaken hands over it in the kitchen of the main house, with a formality that meant something real about what they were to each other. After years of working side by side on land, they both knew better than most people know their own faces. Clara Petch was 60 now and had handed over the boarding house to a younger woman and moved into a small house on the west end of town and had no fewer opinions than before. She came to the ranch every Sunday without fail, brought something she had baked, and argued cheerfully with Fannie about everything from medicine to theology to the best way to put up preserves, and the arguments were one of the pleasures of the week. On a warm September morning in 1888, with the fall light already changing the color of the grass and the first cool edge in the air, Fannie stood in the yard of the Double-A ranch watching her son run toward the barn where his father was working. Samuel's dark hair was going copper at the ends from the summer sun, and he ran the way young children run when they are completely unconscious of observation, with total investment in the forward motion. Clayton emerged from the barn and caught him up in both hands and swung him once, and Samuel's laughter rang across the yard, and the cattle in the near pasture lifted their heads at the sound and then went back to grazing, unimpressed. Ellie was in Fannie's arms, a warm and wriggling weight, looking at everything with the bright and particular attention of a child who is 14 months old and has recently discovered that the world is full of things that respond to examination. She grabbed at Fannie's hair with one fist, and Fannie caught the fist and kissed it, and Ellie said something definitive in the language of 14-month-olds that clearly meant something she felt strongly about. Clayton walked back across the yard with Samuel on his shoulders, and Fannie watched them come, her husband and her son against the September sky of the Texas prairie, and she felt the particular quality of that moment, the way she sometimes felt the quality of moments that deserve to be held, not frantically, not with the grasping anxiety of impermanence, but with the full and open hands of someone who knows that this is the thing, this is the actual thing, and is present for every second of it. He came to stand beside her, and Samuel slid down from his shoulders and immediately ran toward the garden because Rosa was there, and he had decided they were going to look for grasshoppers. Clayton put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Ellie reached out from her mother's arms toward her father's face with that same grabbing fist, and he caught it and kissed it the same way Fannie had. "The fall calves are looking good," he said. "Good. I was thinking about riding out to check the south fence line this week, the part near the creek. Take Samuel on Saturday. He has been asking to go on the long rides. He is almost old enough." He looked down at Ellie. "This one will be riding before she asks permission. She will ride before she walks properly," Fannie agreed. They stood in the September morning, the four of them, in the yard of the ranch that was home in the fullest sense of the word. Home not merely as the place you returned to, but as the place you were building daily, with the specific tools of attention and honesty and patience, and the willingness to be fully known by another person, and to let that knowing be enough. The spoke had sheared through on a May afternoon, and the wheel had cracked, and a woman with a straight spine had walked across a man's pasture with her carpetbag over her shoulder and her chin parallel to the horizon, and he had ridden out to meet her, and the rest had followed with the logic of things that were always going to happen once they began. the particular and irreversible logic of two people who suited each other finding each other at precisely the right time. In the golden and indifferent and deeply consequential heart of the Texas prairie, in the spring of 1882, everything that had been bent was straight, everything that had been missing was found. And the life they had made together stretched forward from that September morning, with the confidence and the beauty of good land in a good season, real and solid and entirely, completely theirs.